Good morning, everyone. Gina Ratto with the legal staff. This is a workshop on the Baggley-Keene Open Meeting Act and the California Public Records Act. These two laws are the primary sunshine laws or transparency and government laws in the state of California, applicable to state agencies. The counterpart to Baggley-Keene, which many of you may have heard of, is the Brown Act. And the Brown Act applies to local agencies and not to calPERS. The Baggley-Keene Act is what applies to calPERS. The Public Records Act is the California version of the Federal Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. And the California Public Records Act is what applies to calPERS. Both of these laws implement a provision of the California Constitution which declares that the meetings of public bodies and the writings of public officials and agencies shall be open to public scrutiny. So again, it's all about transparency in government. And a working understanding of both of these laws is one of the recommended core competencies for the calPERS board members. Jenny Kringle with the legal office is going to start us off this morning with a discussion of the Open Meetings Act. Jenny is an assistant chief counsel in the legal office. After the conversation about the Baggley-Keene Act, we'll have a few hypotheticals, and depending on how much time we have, we'll do more or less of them as time goes on here. She'll then turn it over to Scott Yates with Stakeholder Relations. Scott will give you an overview of the Public Records Act and talk to you about how Public Records Act requests are handled here at calPERS. He'll then turn it back over to Jenny, and she'll give you some additional details on the Public Records Act. Hopefully the hypotheticals that we'll talk about in midstream between Baggley-Keene and the Public Records Act will help drive home the principles that we're hoping you will take away with you today. We're scheduled to go for about an hour, and we're already a little bit behind schedule. So when we reach that hour mark, we'll see where we are, and we might need to cut things off at that point to keep us on schedule for the rest of the day. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny now to talk about Baggley-Keene.
Good morning. I'm Jenny Kringle, calPERS legal staff. So Gina touched on a little bit about the Baggley-Keene Act, so I'd like to jump into the purpose. The purpose of the act is twofold. One, it's that the actions of state agencies be taken openly, but it's also that their deliberations happen openly. So in other words, the act is really intended to invite the public into the entire decision-making process. And in fact, the law specifically states that public servants have not been delegated the right to decide what the public should and should not know. I think this point is really critical and sets the foundation for our whole discussion on Baggley-Keene. If we think of Baggley-Keene as really creating a seat at the table for the public for each decision a state agency makes, then I think those results tend to make more sense. So with that framework, let's dive into the nuts and bolts, and we'll start with the bodies that are covered by the Act. There are 4 types of bodies that are covered by the Act. The first is a body that's established by law. The calPERS board, of course, is an example of a body established by law. The second are bodies that are authorized to take action on behalf of another state body. An example of that would be our board committees. Sometimes that authorization can be formal. Perhaps the board creates another body by resolution and delegates authority to them, but it can also be more subtle than that. The authorization to act could even come from the chair of a committee or the board president. The third body we'll spend a little bit of time talking about is a little bit trickier, and that's an advisory body. So in general, an advisory body is a body that advises another state body. And there's 3 features to an advisory body. The first is that it has to be advisory, and by that we mean it has to make recommendations or suggestions to another state body. If all it does is report information and there's no aspect of that that really ends up being a recommendation or advice or a suggestion, then you don't have an advisory body. The second feature of an advisory body is that it has to be created by formal action. Formal action is interpreted pretty broadly. Formal action might be one body actually formally by resolution creating the advisory body, but it could be as subtle as direction again from the chair of a body, board president. It also can happen after the body's been formed. So if you have a body that would otherwise be an advisory body, and then but for this formal action requirement, and then the board ratifies their existence or approves their agenda, something like that, that can be deemed formal action by the board to create that advisory body. Lastly, the last feature of an advisory body is it has to have 3 or more people. It doesn't mean it has to have 3 board members, and in fact, it doesn't even have to have 3 people related to the organization. Any 3 people, they could be 3 members of the public, but it takes 3 to create an advisory body. If you only have 2 people, you don't have an advisory body. Now, this 3-person requirement sometimes creates confusion. It only applies to advisory bodies, but it doesn't apply to the other kinds of state bodies we're talking about. And sometimes it's confused with the quorum requirement that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The quorum requirement goes to whether you actually have a meeting, whereas this 3-person requirement goes to whether you have an advisory body in the first place. You need 3 people to have, in the aggregate, to have an advisory body, but you only need a majority of that 3 to have a meeting. Okay, so the third type of body that's covered by Baggley-Keene is a body where the members serve that body in their official capacity of a different state body. And this is a bit more unusual. In general, to serve in your official capacity would mean that either you're required to serve that body, either by law or by policy, or the official is doing it on behalf of this other state body, perhaps within the scope of employment or within the scope of their duties to that other state body. So having established the bodies that are covered by the Act, let's turn now, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, back to the slide that addressed the must be 3 or more. So if the chair of any committee would ask 2 board members to investigate an issue, then that's not deemed an advisory, and they can still come back to the committee and report their findings?
Yes. If two people, 2 board members, are the extent of the group and there's no one else in that group, you wouldn't have an advisory body. You might have a body authorized to perform acts on behalf of the board. So it would depend on what has been directed. If you've delegated any kind of authority to those 2 individuals, any authority to act, then although you wouldn't have an advisory body because you only have 2, you might still have the second body I mentioned, a body authorized to take action on behalf of the board. But if authority is not given to them, if it's simply
investigating and reporting back
right.
to the full body.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Then that's not going to constitute an advisory body and fall under Baggley-Keene. That's right. Okay, so having established the bodies covered by the Act, let's talk about the meetings covered by the Act. In general, a meeting occurs if there's a quorum of the body that convenes for the purpose of addressing issues under the body's jurisdiction. Each of those features have some complexities, so let's unpack them a little bit. First off, there has to be a quorum of the body, meaning a majority. And I think we touched upon that a bit with Mr. Jones' question. If you have fewer than a majority of the body at issue, you're not going to have a meeting. But keep in mind, it doesn't necessarily mean a majority of your board. It's a majority of whatever state body is at issue. So you might have a committee, you might have an advisory body. You have to look at what body we're talking about and then determine if there's a majority. Second, the group has to discuss, deliberate, or take some sort of action on an item that's within the jurisdiction of the state body. Now, this requirement's interpreted fairly broadly. There doesn't have to actually be a decision or recommendation that comes out of the meeting. It just has to be a dialogue, a discussion about some issue that is within the scope of the body's jurisdiction. And courts have interpreted that broadly. What that means is that sometimes merely receiving information in some situations could still be a meeting if that information flow from somebody to the body furthers some action on behalf of the body or furthers some understanding on behalf of the body about issues within its jurisdiction. The third aspect of a meeting is that the body has to convene. And of course, this could be traditional way a group gets together where everybody is in the same room like we are now, but it also can happen in many other ways. For example, the body might convene by way of representatives or intermediaries. It also can happen by way of technology. And of course, as we move more and more into a social media world, the opportunities to convene and to communicate by way of technology just continue to increase and become more creative. And so we have to be sensitive to the possibility that meetings can happen in all kinds of ways. Certainly, they can happen by teleconference, they can happen by email, they can happen by phone. The Act goes so far as to even cover a series of communications that in and of themselves don't involve a quorum, but collectively involve a quorum, and these are called serial meetings. So a serial meeting, like I said, is a series of individual communications. It might be a collection of emails. Board member A emails board member B, B emails C, C emails D. Each of those individual emails would not constitute a meeting in and of themselves. They don't involve a quorum, and perhaps they don't really drive any kind of decision. But collectively, when you look at them in the aggregate, you see that a majority of that body has had a discussion on some issue within its jurisdiction. Another way they can happen is with a... Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jenny, but
okay.
is it and maybe you're going to get here and I'm jumping ahead, but what if we individuals don't know that other individuals are having conversations? What is our obligations, I guess, in that situation?
That's a great question. So the question really goes to what you're really asking is what happens when sort of an innocent communication turns into a serial meeting. Before I answer that, let me point out one other way a serial meeting can happen, which I think would probably go to your point, and that's when you have sort of the spoke of the wheel, where you have maybe a single person that is then communicating with each of the members of the body. So there's a phone call by board member A to each person separately on the board, or that could even be staff of the organization. So how do you know and what do you do? I think the good news is that if there's no reason to think that you're having some collective dialogue, then that tends to suggest that you're not. So if it's not furthering a discussion by the whole group, then you're not going to have a meeting. But if in fact what's happening is the same conversation is being repeated and one person in that email or one person in that phone call doesn't know it, then really it's incumbent on the other party to pick up on that and to be sensitive to that. So if I'm the hub of the wheel and I'm reaching out to a majority of a committee and they don't know what anyone else is saying, but I do, and I know that when you look at it in the aggregate, you've really now developed a consensus on some item that committee is going to take action on, then it would be incumbent on me to slow it down before you get to that point and follow Baggley-Keene. But you compare that to spontaneous conversations where perhaps a board member reaches out to staff on an agenda item, and it's not something that is collective, it's not fostering an understanding of the whole body, and that's not going to rise to the level of being a meeting. Yes?